Hi friends. My house is a circus right now. It's really loud, so my friend has graciously offered me her porch and her hat and her blanket and her hot tea, and I'm feeling very loved. Happy holidays to everybody. No matter what you celebrate, I think we're all really excited to ring in a new year. Not gonna miss you 2020. See you, bye. So when we're all done celebrating, we have 1 month, my friends, to fight for our birth freedoms in Nevada. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Maggie. I'm a mom, a parental rights activist, working with Nevada Friends of Midwives, and a midwife. I live in Nevada. We are one of 3 states that enjoy absolute birth freedom. So if you want to be in charge of every aspect of your birth, you have to drive to Kansas, North Dakota, or Nevada. Someone can correct me if I'm wrong, but as far as I can find, those are the remaining states that have not turned over birth choices to some kind of regulatory board. So many of you are watching this because you know that we are at risk of losing this freedom. I'll jump right in, reading from notes. Sorry, never done this before. So there are 2 bills which will be introduced to the legislature coming February. One is a Senate bill sponsored by Senator Hammond, and the other is an Assembly bill which will be sponsored by Assemblywoman Monroe Moreno. Neither one of those people claim to have any special knowledge about home birth, but they were approached by 2 sets of midwives, and they agreed to push their agenda forward. Both have been a little surprised at the backlash, so your voices are being heard. Nevada Friends of Midwives has been an effective and lively group. I love you and I appreciate you. So though these bills have their differences, I am still opposed to both, and I'll get to that in a minute. Both are still in early draft form, and the Senate bill is in pretty good shape. As far as we know, the authors are done writing, and they've been great about keeping us up to date. I don't have problems with that bill, except that it exists, and I'll get to that later. We've just seen the most recent draft for the Assembly bill, and I can tell you that the early drafts were just plain awful. But both of these drafts are going to be constantly changing. As of this week, the original authors have told me that there are many, many people involved in writing the Assembly bill, and we really have no idea what it will look like in February when it finally goes public to the legislative website. The good news is, right now, today, we're still free. If you're having a baby in Nevada, you can choose where and with whom you give birth, and nobody will interfere with your choices. You want to plan cesarean at 37 weeks? You got it. You want to give birth by yourself? Sure. You want a certified nurse midwife in the hospital? Go for it. You want a certified nurse midwife at home? That's available. You want to have your baby in a hot tub under the stars with a disco ball hanging from the trees? Sure, go ahead. If you want a certified professional midwife, there are many of those. If you want a traditional midwife who didn't seek any particular certification for her educational path, there's gobs of those, and you can find them. You just Google them. There are birth centers in the works, although the ladies who are working so hard to open those will tell you that it is just a massive amount of bureaucratic red tape, which is sad. So a pregnant woman in Nevada can Google home birth or midwife and have dozens of options to research. She is completely in control. This is not the case in most states, and that's why women drive to Nevada from other states just to give birth. For instance, in the state of Washington, which is often pointed to as the state that has like the best possible unicorn licensing scenario, if a pregnant woman goes on Google to find a midwife, she's only going to find those midwives that the state wants her to see, because if you're not licensed, you're not allowed to advertise, and you're not allowed to take money, even if your clients can find you. So why in the world would anybody want an unlicensed midwife? Let's say you don't meet all the criteria that your state requires. Maybe you've been deemed by the state to be too old, too overweight, or a mom who's had a cesarean, Or maybe you don't want any vaginal exams, or maybe you don't want any ultrasound. Maybe you don't want to take that gross blood sugar test. Maybe you know your pregnancy is likely to go over 41 weeks and you don't want to be forced into an induction. Maybe you want to be certain that if your labor is very long, or if your water's broken for a long time, you're not going to be packed off to the hospital for some set of rules that, like your time's up, time to go. Or maybe you just really don't like the idea of your midwife answering to anyone but you. I would like to share my story, because that's what we're all doing now. We're sharing our stories, and I hope that everybody will. If you don't know how to do it, just find a good friend who's willing to loan you, her porch and her hat and her editing skills, so we can all share our stories. Mm-hmm. So I was one of those mothers who moved to Nevada just to have control over my birth choices. I want to back up though, and I'll start with my first birth. So my first birth happened in Colorado, and it was nice. I had a very popular certified nurse midwife, and nobody messed with me. And I had done a lot of research. I was only 17, a high school dropout, broke, and on Medicaid. I would walk to the tiny little library on my days off work because I didn't have a car, and I would read everything I could find on pregnancy and birth. The internet was just a useless baby back then, and nobody knew it existed, so we had to read books. I remember where I was sitting in that library basement and what I was wearing when I read Childbirth Without Fear. And when I had read everything that the public library had on pregnancy and birth, I figured out how to get into the state college library. And because I wasn't a student, I didn't have a card, I couldn't check books out, but I would just pack a lunch and I'd walk there and I would stay all day. And I read all of the nurse midwifery textbooks, not the whole things, but I read a lot of them. And I read through all of the obstetrician's textbooks. I read everything that I could find that their library had to offer. The days of not caring for small children. And that was the bedrock of my education later. I came to the conclusion really quickly that I wanted to hire a midwife. I didn't know anyone else who had, but I knew I didn't want your standard run-of-the-mill care in the hospital. It was really important to me that I would be able to move around, that I wouldn't be denied food and drink, that I wouldn't have an IV, that I would be allowed to make noise if I wanted, and that nobody would pressure me to have an epidural. And I really, really did not want an episiotomy. So I started kind of whispering around some older ladies, some friends at church, and asked if any of you ever used a midwife. And so I heard of this practice, and I went there, and there were 3 midwives in this practice, and I met with them all, and 2 treated me like a child, and 1 treated me like I had a brain, so I chose her, and she was marvelous, and that birth was great, and that baby grew up and got married and is having a baby of her own now. That's pretty exciting. So I had an IUD inserted after that baby, and I ended up with some uterine scarring and placenta previa during my next pregnancy, which is deadly. So I knew I would be moving to Nevada, and I got out a phone book and I called some of the midwives in the phone book, and I said, hey, who is the doctor that all of the natural-minded mamas like? And they gave me a phone number, and so I called them, and I made an appointment and moved to Las Vegas very late in pregnancy. And I met with that nice doctor who treated me like I had a brain, even though I was young and on Medicaid. And when I asked him, where can I find out more about placenta previa and C-sections, he walked in with 20 pounds of his textbooks and put them on my lap, and I sat in his office for a couple of hours, and I read until I felt better, and then I scheduled my C-section at 35 weeks, and it was not bad. And it saved my life, and it saved my baby's life, and I'm very grateful for it. But I knew if I ever had another baby, I would do all I could to avoid another C-section. I had 2 frames of reference. I had this nice hospital birth with a certified nurse midwife, and then I had the C-section, and the differences were just so stark. Even though by a lot of definitions, my C-section was not bad and my recovery was fine and everything. But the hardest experience was that sense of unreality. There's just something really crazy about, you're lying on this bed and your arms are tied down like you're being crucified, and bottom half of your body is numb and it feels like it's not there, or it's falling off the bed, and they put up this screen in between you and your baby, so you're just more separated from yourself. And then they surprise you with this odd random baby, like, where'd this baby come from? It was a really disconnected feeling. And breastfeeding was hard, and I didn't get to see my baby for 12 hours, even though she was doing fantastic. And I was just determined to avoid it if I could. And I want to reiterate, super grateful for Western medicine. I love that surgeon. He saved my life. But I also knew I'd never wanted to do that again if I didn't have to. So with my third baby, I was surprised, still broke, still terribly young, still on Medicaid, and living in Arizona. And I got out the phone book and I found a nice certified nurse midwife, because that was my first frame of reference. And I went and I visited the birth center, and it was just so pretty, and they had all these gorgeous curtains, and all the midwives were really nice, and they had these beautiful shiny birth tubs, and I was very excited, and all of our prenatal visits were great. And then really late in pregnancy, she looks at some paperwork and she goes, uh-oh, you've had a cesarean, you're a VBAC, I can't attend you here in the birth center. The state will not allow it. So go pick any hospital you want. I have privileges at all of them, and I'll attend you in the hospital. And so I went and I visited 3 hospitals before I quit, because they had appalling restrictions. I would have to be in bed every moment. I would have to be on monitors every moment. They would draw my blood frequently. And the worst part was that I would be subjected to mandatory vaginal exams every hour. And I went back to the birth center. I said, I can't give birth in any of those hospitals. Tell me about the home birth midwives here. And they said, oh no, they're also licensed by the state, and they are also not allowed to attend VBACs. So sad. And I was very annoyed. So I called a friend who lived in Las Vegas, and I asked her to look in her phone book, because remember, the internet was a useless toddler and nobody knew how to use it. So she looked at the phone book for me, and she gave me some numbers for midwives, and I called a few and I chatted with them, and they were all nice. And then I called Corinne and I asked, are you taking patients? Because at that time I was still used to everybody calling me a patient. And she said, well, sure. And this was a thing then, because there was some kind of medical malpractice crisis going on at the time, and a lot of OBs were not taking any more patients, and I was really late in pregnancy. And so I was pretty excited to begin with that any of these midwives would take me so late in pregnancy. And then I kind of went, oh, will you take a VBAC? And she said, yeah, sure. I take a lot of VBACs. So I drove to Nevada, and I had an appointment with Corinne, and I liked her very, very much, and I knew that I would do whatever it took to hire her. And at 37 weeks, still broke, still young, single, no job, still what so many would call high risk for so many reasons, I moved back to Las Vegas, and I had the easiest, most peaceful, most empowering home birth in a crappy little apartment, and it absolutely changed my life. There was a lot of trauma surrounding that pregnancy, and a lot of uncertainty, and I could not stand the idea of anyone telling me what to do during labor. I could not tolerate the thought of being pinned to a bed or submitting to vaginal exams that I didn't want, and it was incredibly important to me that I felt supported and safe and understood. And a relationship like that doesn't happen in little office visits of 2 or 3 minutes. It takes long conversations and patience and a lot of listening. And Corinne would come to my apartment for our prenatal visits, and she would take off her shoes, and we would drink coffee, and she would stay as long as I wanted. I paid cash for that birth, though Medicaid would have paid 100% of my hospital birth, and I could have gone back to that wonderful doctor and had another not bad C-section. But words cannot express how that birth changed me. I feel the word empowered is overused, but it comes close. I knew for the rest of my life that I could do anything, and I know that so many of you moms out there who are hopefully figuring out how to record your own birth stories and share them, you know what I'm talking about. You didn't know you had that in you. And maybe it had been stolen from you other ways in life. Maybe it had been stolen from you during your previous births. Like my experience where, you know what kind of sounds like a dream birth, where you just kind of lay down and someone does it for you, and then you wake up and, oh, here's your baby. When you own your birth, and you are the powerful one, and those contractions are yours, and that pain is yours, and that work is yours, it changes you. It changes the way that you mother. It changes the way that you're friends to other women. And I am so grateful that the state of Arizona would not pay for the birth that I thought I wanted, because then I ended up with the birth that I needed in Nevada. And I'm still here. Soon after that birth, I married the amazing Mr. Alvarez, and I went on to have a total of 8 home births here in Las Vegas, and many of them would not have been allowed in other states. So 6 of them happened at well past 41, 42 weeks. Some happened after I turned 35. I always had that C-section in my past. After some, like 5 babies, some states won't let you have a home birth. And I would just be viewed as a liability. But I had done my own research, and I took good care of myself, and I was confident in my choice. And thankfully, all of those 8 births were wonderful and smooth and perfect. So some may be wondering why I make such a point to explain my financial position. There is a lot of talk about how uneducated, poor people don't have access to home birth midwives. There's a lot of talk in particular about how poor Black women don't have access to home births, presumably because these midwives can't accept Medicaid. But it's just not true that they don't have access. We're here. There's nobody blocking you from finding us. I was a desperately poor person, but having a home birth was a really high priority for me, and there was nobody in the way blocking me from finding Corinne, and nobody involved in our business transactions, and we were able to strike a deal. In fact, we didn't even really have to strike a deal. I paid her whole fee because it was ridiculously small. Corinne took and still takes a lot of poor clients, a lot of Hispanic women, a lot of people on food stamps. She says if someone really, really wants to hire me and I can see that, I'm going to work with them. And she's not going to turn them away. And this is true of most midwives that I know. Corinne does this because she remembers being poor when she wanted to have her first home birth, and her husband delivered pizzas at night to pay for their midwife, because it meant so much to them. I personally love bartering with my own clients. There's something really satisfying about having a set of shelves built for you, or babysitting, or haircuts for your kids, or baskets of fresh eggs, or some concrete poured in your driveway. And most midwives I know will barter. They have sliding scale fees, and they're really willing to work with anybody who is really, really committed to having their home birth. I also put so much emphasis on the research that I did, because there's a lot of talk about how licensure will fix problems in the birthing community, when really education will fix those problems. I'm talking about both the education of the midwives and the education of the families who are seeking their care. So when I brought this up to the authors of the Assembly Bill many years ago, during a really heated discussion about whether or not we should push for licensure of midwives in Nevada, they answered, well, we just don't have the resources to provide education, and not all people have the resources to get educated. And I went, oh, it took me a few minutes to realize that when I say education, it means something completely different to me than it does to the people who are writing these bills. So when I say education, that means, walking to the library and reading books and talking to people and making phone calls and just not giving up until you find out all that you need to know to make a good decision. And when they say education, they mean like committees and subcommittees and, grants from the government and, paying to send someone to college or something like that. Of course, someone's going to point out that I was privileged to be literate. And I just want to remind us all that even the poorest of Americans has a cell phone with internet access. So even if you don't speak English or you don't read, you can watch thousands of YouTube videos and you can find out all you want to know about pregnancy and birth. The foundation of Corinne's practice is what amounts to free education. Enormous amounts of time are dedicated to creating circles, as we call them, meetings of nonprofit organizations like La Leche League, Improving Birth, the International Cesarean Awareness Network, hours and hours spent over coffee, over dinner, over play dates at the park with our kids. This is where the real education happens. That's education. And it's also where families are embraced into solid community and support. You don't get that from going to your obstetrician's office or your nurse midwife's office for 5 or 10 minutes for each visit. You just don't get that. This model of care is enthusiastically embraced by many, many midwives here. This is also what anti-racism and anti-classism and anti-sexism and anti-all the isms looks like, and is the answer to the disparities in the birthing world. It's hard for isms to hang around when you have your black Muslim mom sitting next to your white evangelical Christian mom, and you've got your poor families and your vegan families and your carnivore families and your Medicaid families. You have people from all walks of life, and they're all just talking about what to do about back pain and labor or how to potty train your toddler. And the toddlers are all there playing together, and they're making friends that they're going to have for the rest of their lives, and they're getting a free education too. So, the amazing Mr. Alvarez was enough of a saint to put up with me leaving in the middle of the night all the time to attend births with Corinne. And after 20 or so births, she said, you need to be charging people and calling yourself a doula. So I scraped together the money for a doula certification course, which nobody ever asked about one time ever. I'd been working as a licensed massage therapist for years before that, and all those years nobody asked me about my massage license either. And I began attending some hospital births, which had a lot more to do with me acting as a buffer against abuse than the usual, feeding a mom pizza in between contractions and rubbing her back like I was used to at the home births that I had attended. And some time passed, and another 20 or 30 births passed, and then Corinne said, oh, hey, here's the checklist of what you would have to do to become a certified professional midwife. Have fun. And I laughed because I had no intention of becoming a midwife. I said this over and over, and she would smile and nod, and then she'd hand me the gloves to catch the next baby, or ask what I thought about the heart tones of a baby who had these weird prearterial contractions, or, she'd casually mention, oh, wouldn't it be so fun if you went to that neonatal resuscitation class over in Utah with all the other cool midwives from these states? And so I kept doing these things because they were really fun and because I felt they were important. And because so many of Corinne's clients became my clients, either for massage or for doula services, and since so many of them became really, really good friends, I was often present with a laboring mother by myself for hours and hours and hours. So my official role would vary depending on the particular mother. And I could be there simply as a friend, or as a paid doula, or as a massage therapist, or as Corinne's student. And sometimes this meant that I ended up catching a baby by myself, and that was fine. And sometimes it meant that I just did dishes while mom rested, and that was fine. What mattered was that my friend was supported, and she wasn't alone. And Corinne could be attending another birth across town or catching up on sleep, and everybody was taken care of. Those long, long hours, sometimes days, spent with these laboring moms, just observing and watching and hanging out, those were really foundational to my education in birth work. Sometimes I would live closer to the birthing mom than Corinne, and she would call and say, you need to come in a hurry, and so I would drive there and immediately catch a baby, and that was fine too. This kind of practice is really, really common amongst midwives, and it's really beneficial for everyone. But it is absolutely forbidden in the Assembly Bill, and this is one thing that they've said is very, very important to them, and they're really not willing to give up this language. The authors feel that student midwives must never, never attend a laboring woman alone, and if they're going to attend supervised, then they have to pay a fee and be certified to be a student midwife. So midwives no longer have the freedom to develop slow, patient relationships with their students, deciding together what their educational path is going to be. It has to be dictated by the state. And if a mother is having a baby alone, well, her midwife student is sitting in the driveway waiting for the midwife to arrive, well, then so be it. She has her baby alone. Student midwives no longer have the benefit of those long, long hours alone with a mom to learn and grow her observation skills. And it'll force birth workers into narrow definitions. Instead of just allowing these organic relationships between friends and sisters to just be what they are, well, birth workers slowly evolve into what they eventually decide upon. So all you doulas out there, all you apprentices, all you aunties and sisters, and you birth photographers who are kind of dabbling in an apprenticeship, all you ladies who just keep finding yourselves habitually attending birth after birth after birth because all your friends are having babies, look for this to be a very slippery slope and a really sore topic if this is made into law. So about these bills. I said earlier that I have no problems with the Senate bill, except that it exists. Let me explain what I mean by that. The authors listened and they engaged in conversation and they altered their language into something pretty acceptable. Their bill seeks to only license CPMs. In fact, the other bill does too. That's certified professional midwives, and it totally exempts all other midwives. There's no language requiring us to explain why we're choosing to not become licensed or to make our clients sign forms saying that we're somehow less safe than a licensed midwife. It's not a bad bill. But bills are really fluid and slippery things, and they have to go through a lot of hands to become a law. And by the time you have your finished product, it can look nothing like what you started with. It's totally out of your hands also once it becomes a law. So when lawmakers are asked to define things and own things and regulate things, and they're given power over an area of your life, they never, ever, ever give it back. Especially in a case like this when the regulatory board has not even been decided upon, like we don't even know who's going to be on it. And it'll constantly be changing every few years. And a law that everyone can be really happy with in the beginning can make everybody really miserable with the flick of a pen. You could start out with a board that allows midwives to attend practically any mother she wants, and then you can end up with a law that doesn't allow her to wipe the forehead of a laboring mother without permission. Also, we have the completely awful Assembly bill to contend with, and it is very, very, very likely that it'll be blended with the other one. You can't have two bills like this at the same time. The House and the Senate and innumerable committees and subcommittees and all these people in between get to decide what stays and what goes. So we had to cut because there was a loud kid, and I went and I collected this little sample home birth baby. He was born at home, and all of his little aunties and uncles were born at home, and now he's making his premiere. So it is my sincere desire that both of these bills are dropped, but it's wishful thinking. So I just want to encourage everyone to keep writing and emailing your representatives and taking part in this conversation. And thanks for sticking with me for this long video. Merry Christmas.